A man can live alone in the mountains for years, but it only takes one moment to realize he's been blind to the world around him. The wind cut sharp through the valley, rattling the trees as Felix Graham stepped onto the wooden porch of Brewer's Cafe. The place had been here for decades, a squat red brick building on the edge of town, the kind where the coffee was always burnt but strong enough to wake the dead. Felix pulled his coat tighter, shook the snow off his boots, and stepped inside. Zane Brewer stood behind the counter, apron dusted with flour, a pot of coffee in one hand and a plate of biscuits in the other. "Well, look what the wind dragged in. Thought you froze to death up there." Felix grunted, shaking the cold from his shoulders. "Almost. You got that coffee, or are you just holding it for warmth?" Zane chuckled and poured him a mug. "Same as always. Black as hell, hot as sin." He slid it across the counter. "What brings you down?" "Supplies." Felix nodded. "That and to remind myself why I don't live in town." Zane smirked, wiping his hands on a rag. "Well, you picked a good day. Town's got its usual share of drama." Felix didn't respond, just let the coffee burn down his throat. He wasn't much for small talk, but Zane didn't seem to care. "Seen Giselle Roberts around a lot lately," Zane went on. "Funny thing, she's been hanging around Dixon's flowers. Oscar's been real attentive. Guy's got a thing for poetry, or so she says." Felix didn't move, just took another slow sip. Zane kept talking, oblivious. "She always said she never had time for all that flowery nonsense. Guess people change." He shook his head. "Damien knows she's been spending time with the florist?" Felix set the mug down, steady. "Doubt it." Zane let out a low whistle. "Damn shame if something's going on. Damien's a good man." Felix said nothing. He didn't like getting involved in town gossip. But Damien wasn't just some name in the cafe's conversations. They'd built houses together, spent winters fixing roofs, worked until their backs ached. Felix had known Damien when he was fresh out of high school, had stood beside him at his wedding, seen him build a life with Giselle. He finished his coffee in silence, nodded at Zane, and stepped back into the cold. The snow was falling heavier now, thick flakes swirling in the wind. Felix pulled his coat tight and made his way to the general store. He told himself it wasn't his problem, but damn if it didn't sit wrong. He remembered Damien's last letter, written in his usual rough handwriting, the kind of scrawl a man makes when he isn't used to putting thoughts on paper. Giselle had taken an interest in books lately, stayed out longer, had new friends. Damien thought maybe she was just restless, that she needed something new to keep her mind occupied. Now Felix wasn't so sure. He finished loading his supplies into the truck, the weight of it pressing in his gut. He didn't want to be here longer than he had to be. But something told him he needed to stay. For Damien. Felix drove out of town as the snow thickened, his truck rattling over the worn two-lane road that led back to his cabin. The tires crunched against the frozen dirt, headlights cutting through the dusk. He should have just left it alone. Damien was a grown man, and if something was happening, it wasn't Felix's job to fix it. But the thought sat heavy, like a stone lodged under his ribs. He pulled off the road near the clearing where the town met the hills, killed the engine, and sat for a moment. A little bar sat on the corner, the Rusted Stag, a place for locals looking to drink away the cold. Through the window, he spotted Giselle at the counter, laughing, her hand resting just a little too easily on the arm of a man beside her. Oscar Dixon. Felix exhaled through his nose. He stepped out, pulled his coat tighter, and walked through the door. The warmth hit him first, a wall of beer, sweat, and old wood. The bar was half full, mostly locals winding down from the week. Giselle hadn't noticed him. Neither had Oscar. They were leaning close, her fingers tracing the rim of her glass as she smiled, something easy and familiar in the way they sat together. Felix walked up to the bar, caught the bartender's attention with a nod. The man slid a whiskey his way. He didn't touch it. Oscar finally noticed him, stiffening slightly before covering it with a grin. "Felix Graham. Didn't take you for the social type?" Felix didn't answer. Just let his gaze drift from Oscar to Giselle. She hesitated, then forced a smile. "You're a long way from your mountain. Supply run." Felix picked up the glass, turned it in his hand. "Didn't expect to see you here." Giselle glanced at Oscar, then back to Felix. "Nothing wrong with a night out." Felix took a slow sip, let the burn settle in his chest. "That what you call it?" Oscar shifted, setting his glass down with a little too much care. "Look, Felix." Felix cut him off. "Don't." His voice was even, but solid. "Not gonna waste time on lies." Giselle's jaw tightened. "This isn't your business." Felix studied her. The same woman who had once clung to Damien's arm like he was her whole world. The same woman who had sworn up and down that she'd never be like the kind that ran when life got hard. She was looking at him now like he was an inconvenience, like his presence was something to be brushed off. "You're right," he said. "It ain't." He set the glass down and turned to Oscar. "But you sure as hell are gonna stay away from Damien. And if you got any sense, you'll walk out of here and never look at her again." Oscar let out a breath that was supposed to sound amused, but there was a flicker of something else in his eyes. Unease. He wasn't a fool. He knew who Felix was, knew the weight his name carried around these parts. Giselle pushed back from the bar, grabbing her coat. "You don't get to make demands, Felix." He didn't move, didn't raise his voice. Just looked at her, steady. "I'm not asking." For a long moment, no one spoke. The bar noise carried on around them, glasses clinking, muted conversation humming in the background. Then Giselle grabbed Oscar's arm and pulled him toward the door. They walked out without another word. Felix watched them go, then signaled for another drink. He wouldn't follow, wouldn't call Damien just yet. But this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Felix didn't head straight back to the mountains that night. He stayed in town, parked off Main Street in his truck with the seat reclined, the heater running low. Sleep didn't come easy. He wasn't the kind of man to sit on his hands when he knew something needed fixing. By morning, he had a plan. First stop was the post office. Felix stepped inside, rubbing his hands together to shake off the morning chill. The old woman behind the counter barely looked up before sliding a thick envelope across to him. "Damien's letter came in yesterday," she said, adjusting her glasses. "Told me to hold it till you came down." Felix took it, gave a nod of thanks, and stepped outside before sliding a knife along the top. Damien's handwriting was rough, a mix of print and cursive, the kind of scrawl a man makes when he doesn't write often. Felix scanned the page, jaw tightening as he read. Damien wasn't dumb. He'd noticed the changes. The late nights. The sudden new interests. He hadn't confronted Giselle yet. He still wanted to believe there was an explanation. He asked if Felix had seen anything, if he thought maybe Giselle was just restless, if there was something Damien could do to bring her back. Felix folded the letter and tucked it into his coat. Damien was asking for an answer, but Felix knew the truth wouldn't come easy. A man like Damien, the kind who believed in hard work, in marriage, in building a life, he wasn't ready to see it fall apart. Felix climbed into his truck and drove to Dixon's Flowers. The shop sat on the corner of a quiet street, a neat little building with big glass windows and a bell over the door. He didn't go in. Instead, he parked across the street and watched. Oscar showed up around 10, stepping out of his car with the easy gait of a man who didn't have a care in the world. Felix took note of the details, the pressed shirt, the careful way Oscar adjusted his sleeves before unlocking the shop. A man concerned with appearances. A man who thought he had nothing to lose. Felix pulled out his phone. He wasn't much for technology, but he knew enough to look up a number. He pressed the call button and waited. A few rings, then a gruff voice answered. "Yeah." Felix leaned back in his seat. "Mr. Dixon. Name's Felix Graham. We need to talk about your son." There was a long pause. Then the voice came back, colder this time. "What about him?" Felix glanced toward the shop. "Let's just say I got some news you're not gonna like." Another pause. "You in town?" "I am." "Then meet me at McBride's Diner in an hour." The line went dead. Felix slid his phone back into his pocket, then looked out the window at Oscar Dixon. The man had no idea what was coming. McBride's Diner sat on the edge of town, the kind of place that hadn't changed in 50 years. The coffee was always hot, the pie was decent, and the waitress behind the counter knew everyone's business before they did. Felix stepped inside, shaking the cold from his coat, and spotted Wesley Dixon in a back booth. The man was in his 60s, built solid like an old oak, his silver hair neatly combed. He wore a crisp button-down under a heavy coat, hands wrapped around a coffee cup as he watched Felix approach. Felix slid into the booth across from him. "You've got 5 minutes," Wesley said, his voice even, unreadable. Felix pulled out his phone, tapped the screen a few times, and set it on the table. A grainy photo came up, Oscar and Giselle sitting too close at the rusted stag, her hand on his arm, his leaning into hers. Another swipe, and there was a shot from 2 nights ago, Oscar unlocking his shop's back door while Giselle slipped inside. Wesley didn't react right away. He studied the photos, his expression giving nothing away, but Felix could see the way his fingers tightened around the cup. Finally, he exhaled through his nose, slow and measured. "You take these." Felix shook his head. "No, but I got him from someone who don't much care for your boy sniffing around another man's wife." Wesley rubbed his thumb along the rim of his cup, silent for a long moment. Then he looked up, meeting Felix's eyes. You telling me this cause you want something? Felix leaned back against the booth. Just figured you'd want to know what kind of man you raised. You put up the money for his shop, didn't you? Wesley's jaw tightened. Felix nodded. Thought so. Now, I don't give a damn about your family's money, but I do care about Damien. He's got no idea what's going on. And when he finds out, it's gonna hit him like a hammer. Wesley finally set his coffee down. Oscar's a damn fool. His voice was quiet, but there was steel in it. Always had too much charm and not enough sense. Felix didn't argue. He let the silence settle between them, watching as Wesley ran a hand over his face, the weight of it all pressing down on him. Then the old man straightened, his expression hardening. I'll handle my son, he said. Felix gave a small nod. Good. He stood up, slipping his phone back into his pocket. As he turned to leave, Wesley spoke again, voice low. What about the wife? Felix stopped, glancing back. What about her? Wesley studied him. Your friend's wife. You just letting her off easy. Felix exhaled through his nose. No, but I ain't done yet. Wesley gave a slow nod, then picked up his coffee again. Felix didn't wait for anything else. He walked out into the cold, the doors swinging shut behind him. By the time he got back into town, the first tremors were already shaking. News traveled fast in places like this. By noon, whispers had started circulating about Oscar's shop struggling. By evening, Felix heard from Zena Carter, Damien's childhood friend, that Oscar had been called to a private meeting with his father. By the next morning, Oscar's financial backing had been pulled. Felix didn't go back to the flower shop. Didn't need to. Instead, he waited. Because Giselle Roberts still had a storm coming, and he wasn't done making sure she felt every second of it. Felix didn't hear from Damien for a few days, which wasn't surprising. A man needed time to process something like this. No matter how tough you were, finding out your wife had been slipping off with another man wasn't something you just shook off overnight. Felix spent the time how he always did, splitting wood, checking his traps, keeping busy. The mountain didn't care about town gossip. It didn't care about cheating wives or ruined men. The cold rolled in, the river still flowed under its frozen skin, and the work never stopped. That was the difference between men like Oscar Dixon and men like Damien Roberts. Some men spent their lives trying to make things easy. Others understood that life was hard, and you either built yourself up for it, or you got buried under it. When Damien finally came looking for him, it was just past sunrise. Felix had been gutting a fresh catch, hands red up to the wrists, when he heard the familiar crunch of boots on frost. He didn't turn around. Didn't need to. You look like hell, Felix said, wiping his hands on a rag. Damien stopped a few feet away, shoving his hands deep into his coat pockets. He did look rough. Dark circles under his eyes, beard untrimmed. He'd lost weight. Or maybe he was just carrying himself different now. Lighter, in a way. She's gone, Damien said, voice flat. Felix tossed the rag onto a nearby stump. Where? No idea. Took what she could and left. Damien let out a short laugh, one with no humor in it. She tried to make a scene when I told her it was over. Thought I'd beg her to stay. Told me she was just finding herself, that I was too closed off, too focused on work. His jaw tightened. I told her I'd been focused on work so she could live the life she wanted. Told her I'd built her a home, a future, and she threw it away for a man who smells like lilacs. Felix snorted. Damien shook his head. Her parents found out. They're done with her. Told her if she wanted to play the free spirit, she could do it on her own dime. She lost them, lost me, lost everything. Felix studied him for a long moment. That what you wanted? Damien looked past him, out toward the trees, breath clouding in the cold air. What I wanted was my wife to be who I thought she was. He exhaled slow. But that woman doesn't exist. Felix nodded, picking up his knife again. Then you got nothing left to do but move on. Damien gave a humorless chuckle. You make it sound easy. Felix went back to gutting the fish. Didn't say it was easy. Just said that's what's left. Damien was quiet for a long time, watching the trees. Finally, he took a deep breath, squared his shoulders. Thinking about taking a trip, he said. Out of town for a while. Maybe out west. Clear my head. Felix didn't look up. Might do you good. Damien hesitated. Then, softer, you ever think about coming back? Felix wiped the blade clean, finally looking at him. Back to what? Damien gave a small shrug. Town. People. A life that isn't just trees and snow. Felix just shook his head. This is where I belong. Damien nodded like he expected that answer. He shifted his weight, then held out a hand. Felix wiped his own off and took it, a firm grip between men who understood more than words could say. If you ever come down off this mountain, Damien said, first drinks on me. Felix smirked. Damn right it is. Damien gave him a final nod, then turned and walked back toward his truck. Felix watched him go, the sound of the engine fading into the stillness. Then he picked up his knife and got back to work. A week passed. The town moved on the way small towns always did, chewing on fresh gossip before spitting it out for the next big thing. Oscar Dixon's shop was still open, but it had lost something. Its warmth, its ease. The kind of customers who once lingered now grabbed their orders and left. Word had gotten around, the way Felix knew it would. People didn't like a man who made his living selling flowers while sneaking around with another man's wife. Giselle had disappeared. No forwarding address, no goodbyes. A woman like that never stayed where the wreckage was. She'd go somewhere new, put on a different face, find another man to buy her drinks, and tell her she was special. It wasn't Felix's problem anymore. Never had been. Felix stayed up in the mountains, chopping wood, hunting, working on repairs before the next big snowstorm rolled in. He told himself things were settled, that he'd done what needed doing. But he knew better. The mountains might have kept him apart from people, but they hadn't stripped him of instincts. And his gut told him there was one last thing left unfinished. So when he rolled into town that morning, he didn't stop at Brewer's Cafe or the hardware store. He went straight to Oscar Dixon's shop. The bell jingled as he stepped inside. Oscar was behind the counter, tying off a bouquet, fingers moving fast, almost nervous. He looked up, and his face went tight, like he'd been waiting for this moment and dreading it all the same. Felix shut the door behind him and took his time looking around. Shelves full of fresh-cut arrangements, the air thick with the scent of roses and eucalyptus. Soft music playing low from the radio. Everything just as it should be, except for the man behind the counter, who looked like he hadn't slept in days. Felix stepped closer. Been busy. Oscar swallowed, set the bouquet down. What do you want, Felix? Felix tilted his head, taking in the way the younger man's shoulders tensed. I want to know something. You ever think about Damien? About what you took from him? Oscar's mouth pressed into a thin line. I didn't take anything. Giselle made her choices. Felix nodded, like that was an answer worth considering. That how you sleep at night? Oscar exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face. Look, I get it. You think I ruined his life. But Damien's a big boy, and Giselle, she was never happy. She wanted something else. Felix let the silence stretch, let the weight of it sink in. Finally, he said, you know why men like you never last? Why people turn on you? Oscar didn't answer. Felix leaned on the counter, voice steady. Because you take without thinking. You see something, you want it, and you never ask what it costs. He picked up the bouquet Oscar had been working on, turning it in his hands. Thing is, there's always a cost. Oscar's jaw tightened. Is this supposed to be a threat? Felix set the bouquet down, real gentle. It's a fact. He straightened, adjusting his coat. Damien's moving on. But this town? It remembers. You're going to spend the next few years paying for what you did in ways you don't even see coming. Oscar swallowed hard, looking away. Felix didn't bother with a goodbye. Just walked to the door, pushed it open, and stepped out into the cold. The wind had picked up, cutting through the streets, scattering a few loose petals onto the sidewalk. Felix glanced at them, then shook his head. Some things weren't meant to last. Some things didn't deserve to. He climbed into his truck, started the engine, and pulled onto the road. He had nothing left to do in town. The mountains were waiting. The snow was falling again by the time Felix made it back to the cabin, thick flakes swirling in the wind, covering the tracks he'd left that morning. He parked the truck, grabbed the bags from the bed, and stepped onto the porch, shaking the cold off his coat before pushing open the door. The fire had burned low, leaving only embers, but the place held its warmth. He set the bags down, pulled off his gloves, and went about his routine, stoking the fire, checking the traps he'd set outside, making sure the roof hadn't sprung a new leak. The world kept moving. Damien sent a letter a few weeks later. Felix found it in the usual spot at the post office, the handwriting rough, familiar. Inside, a single sheet of paper. No wasted words. Felix. Headed west for a while. Got a job lined up with an old friend in Colorado. Fresh start. Figure it's about time. You were right about everything. Thanks for that. First drink's still on me. Damien. Felix folded the letter, tucked it into his coat, and walked out without a word. Oscar Dixon's shop closed for good not long after. The town didn't need a florist who couldn't keep his hands off another man's wife. The last Felix heard, he'd packed up and left. No big send-off, no tears. Just another man who thought he could take without consequence, learning too late that the world had a way of balancing the books. Giselle never came back. Wherever she landed, it wasn't here. That suited Felix just fine. He spent the rest of the winter alone, the way he liked it. The cabin held steady against the cold, the trees whispering in the wind, the river carving its slow path through the valley. The work never stopped. The land never betrayed. That was enough. One afternoon, just before the first real thaw, he heard the sound of an engine climbing the road. Not many people came out this way unless they had a reason. Felix stepped onto the porch, wiping his hands on a rag, and watched as an old pickup crawled up the path, tires kicking up mud and slush. It rolled to a stop, and when the door opened, he wasn't all that surprised to see Zena Carter step out, hands shoved into her coat pockets, eyes sharp as ever. She looked up at him, smirked. Figured you'd still be out here playing mountain man. Felix leaned against the porch railing. And yet, here you are. She walked up, stopping at the bottom of the steps. Came to let you know Damien's doing good. Got himself settled, making real money. Seems lighter these days. Felix nodded. Good for him. Zena studied him for a moment, then snorted. You're a real bastard, you know that? Felix raised a brow. You knew exactly how this would play out. Knew that town would tear Oscar apart without you ever having to throw a punch. Knew Damien just needed a push to get out. She shook her head, grinning. Cold as hell. Felix shrugged. Ain't my fault people don't like cheaters. She let out a short laugh, then pulled something from her pocket. A small envelope. Folded, creased at the edges. Damien wanted you to have this. Figured you wouldn't answer the phone. Felix took it, but didn't open it. Just tucked it into his coat. Zena glanced at the cabin, at the trees beyond it, then back at him. You ever think about coming down off this hill for good? Felix shook his head. Not my place. She nodded like she expected that answer, then took a step back. Well, if you ever change your mind, try not to let another decade go by before you show your face. Felix smirked. No promises. She rolled her eyes, climbed back into the truck, and pulled away, leaving nothing but tire tracks and the scent of burning fuel. Felix stayed there a while, watching the sun sink lower, feeling the cold settle into his bones. He pulled the letter from his coat, turned it over in his hands. Then, without opening it, he tossed it onto the fire. The past was settled. Some men spent their lives running. Some men spent their lives chasing. Felix Graham had spent his life standing his ground. And as the flames ate away the paper, curling it into blackened ash, he figured he'd done just fine. He stepped off the porch, picked up the axe, and went back to work. The wind howled through the trees, the snow crunched beneath his boots, and the mountains stood just as they always had.